everyone. On this week's 3 in 3, we'll be looking at what to wear as we prepare to lead God's people in praise and worship. Truth is that both males and females should be mindful of what we wear as we prepare to lead God's people in praise and worship. But this week's talk is primarily skewed towards the females. So with that said, let's get started. The first thing I'd like to say is that we should be compliant. What do I mean by that? I believe that we should lovingly submit. You see, if we are truthful, we recognize that our churches, many of them have established dress codes. And we as leaders, as praise and worship leaders, should submit to those rules. Why? Because as we submit, we're submitting first to God, then to our leaders. And as we submit to God, we are really saying to Him, Lord, I submit to the authority that you have placed over me and in my life. So as much as possible, let's lovingly submit. Because when we don't do that, we're actually rebelling. You know, 1 Peter 5:5 puts this whole clothing thing into perspective. You see, Peter encourages us to clothe ourselves with humility. That's what the scripture says. So let's focus on being humble and compliant. The second thing I'd like to say is that we should be aware of our local culture. Now, every local church has a culture. And if we are truthful, we'll recognize that some things may be appropriate in one culture, but they may not be appropriate in ours. And while it's not a sin, we should be aware of that. So, you know, my mind goes back again to 1 Corinthians, where Paul says everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. And since our clothing isn't such a big deal, we shouldn't make it a big deal. So if we find that our clothing may not be culturally appropriate, let's avoid it. And I'm going to admit, this one is hard for me sometimes. The last thing I'd like to focus on is cut. Now, what do I mean by cut? You see, I believe that we are all fearfully and wonderfully made. The scripture also says that. But when we're leading God's people into praise and worship, that's not the time for us to be showing off our physique. No, our primary role as worship leaders is to point people to God. So if it's too tight, if it's too short, if it's see-through, it's best to avoid it. Because as Timothy also reminds us, we should ensure that we are clothed in modesty. So those are the 3 tips that we've discussed today: compliance, cut, and culture. You see, I know sometimes it can be hard to do these things, but I believe that, as I said before, if we focus on the inner man, it will become so much easier for us to dress the outer man. Have a good one, guys. See you next time.